Hi folks, welcome to week 5 of English 261. This week, since I couldn't get into the studio because it's President's Day, I'm going to be recording this from my home office, so unfortunately you're not going to have a computer screen accompanying you, and you'll probably have to look at me more than you probably want to, so you may just want to go ahead and, I don't know, maybe just minimize my face and just listen to it or something along those lines. So, today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about poets of the 16th and 17th century, kind of continuing with what we were discussing last week about Elizabeth and the Renaissance, and then moving into what we were discussing to more towards the Enlightenment and things along those lines. So for this week, we're going to start off with Ben Jonson. And Ben Jonson was an author, a poet, and a playwright under James I, who succeeded Queen Elizabeth. Ben Jonson was probably most famous as a playwright, though he was rather well known as a poet. But his most favorite, probably his most favorite classic poems are The Fox, The Alchemist. But Ben Jonson was probably second, probably only to Shakespeare, as major men of letters of this time period. So, despite the fact I do like Christopher Marlowe a little bit more. So let's go ahead and talk about Ben Jonson's A Fit of Rhyme Against Rhyme, which is on page 215. The Fit of Rhyme Against Rhyme is kind of an interesting poem because it's interesting because of the content to some extent, but it's also interesting because of the actual what's going on in the poem and how it's structured. One of the things, even in this time period, there was a debate about whether or not rhyming poetry was the way poetry should actually be. People in the past did think there were clear ways that poetry should in fact be. So there was real discussion about whether poems should rhyme or not rhyme. And it kind of went back to, if you read the footnotes in this section, it went back to the discussion of the Romans and the Greeks, who early on, Greek poetry did not rhyme, then later on Roman poetry did when they got Latin involved. Then for a while it stopped rhyming. So there's a discussion about whether rhyme is something that should be included in poetry. And interestingly enough, what I like about this poem, and what I think Jonson's doing a very interesting job of here, is he's writing a rhyming poem that's against the idea of rhyming. And if you read it, what he does is he rhymes perfectly. But the other thing he does is he varies the line length, he varies rhythms frequently, and also the length and breadth of lines he varies fairly often. The meter is not consistent, neither is the rhythm, but the rhyme is consistent. And what it does is it kind of creates the effect of a really unbalanced poem, and it's almost intentionally unbalanced. So for example, if you read it, rhyme the rack of finest wit that express it but by fits true conceit. Those drop lines, the third lines, where it seems to be that you're going to get into kind of like a sing-song rhyme pattern, then Jonson drops the line. Spoiling senses of their treasure, cozying judgment with a measure, but false weight. It's those drop lines, he does a really great job of just harshly contrasting the rhyme of the first two lines of the third line, and these short little lines that kind of just make the rhyme structure fall apart. Resting words nurture culling, propping verse or feeling of falling to the ground. I mean, it's just a very kind of effective way of pointing out that rhyme in itself will not carry a poem effectively. So, and it's just a very kind of, and it's got a lot of little clever little bits in here. He that first invented thee, may his joints tormented be, cramped forever. I mean, just kind of lovely stuff about not enjoying rhyme, or not thinking that rhyme is the artistic output that it should be. And to be entirely fair, Jonson did use rhyme quite a bit, but here he's pointing out that rhyme alone is not enough to make poetry beautiful. So I think it's kind of an interesting little pace to look at. Alright, let's go ahead and take a look at Lady Mary Ross from A Crown of Sonnets Dedicated to Love. And that would be 77, the 77th sonnet in the collection. Mary Roth, let's see, 223. Yeah, from A Crown of Sonnets Dedicated to Love. And Mary Roth was, she was from a literary family. She was actually related to Sir Walter Raleigh. And she was actually one of the first female British writers to actually ever be remembered after her time period. Also, the Pamphylian Amphilanthus is a sonic sequence by, it's the only second sonic sequence by a woman we actually have in English history, and also she's one of the first women to actually write a prose story in English. So Mary Roth has kind of a rather rich kind of literary background to her. And I think this is actually a really beautiful sonnet. In this strange labyrinth, how shall I turn? Ways are on all sides, while the way I miss. If to the right hand, there in love I burn, let me go forward, therein danger is. If to the left suspicion hinders bliss, let me turn back, shame cries I ought return. Nor faint, though crosses my fortune's kiss, stand still is harder, although sure to mourn. Thus let me take right, left, or left-hand way, go forward or stand still or back retire. I must these doubts endure without delay, or help but travail find for my best hire. Yet that which my most troubled sense doth move is to leave it all and take the thread of love. One of the things you'll notice about a lot of the poems you read this week is there's pretty extensive connections to Greek mythology, and that was actually kind of very, very much the case here. And this, of course, is a very, very strong connection to the Theseus and the Labyrinth of Crete and the Minotaur story. And what this poem's really about, it's about when in situations where you love, you get lost in the labyrinth of trying to decide what's the appropriate thing to do in a given relationship or love situation. Trust the thread of love, the thing that guides you, the thing that pulls you, the thing that will lead you through the way. And trust not so much in your sense of direction or your own thoughts, but trust in love itself. And that's kind of the overall idea of the poem. And it's kind of a lovely little sonnet, and I just wanted to have us read it because it does some very interesting things with rhymes. It's not too sing-songy. It's got kind of a nice sonic structure to it, and also it's just kind of an interesting way to take a look at sonnets. Let's also take a look at George Herbert. George Herbert is let's see, Easter Wings, 236. And this is a poem that you might have noticed kind of interesting when you were taking a look at it. What this is called it's called a pattern poem. And George Herbert was a poet, an orator, and a priest. He was also what they called a metaphysical poet, which meant all of his poems had kind of a conceit to them. There was some sort of overriding idea that was built into it. Some people actually called it Baroque poetry just because of its ornamentation and its elaborations and things along those lines. But he was very, very devoted, and he was very much a devotionalist, so much of his writing is about God and about religion. And Easter Wings is definitely that. But the thing I think is really interesting to take a look at, and if you read Easter Wings, you'll see that the actual structure of the poem actually fits the meaning of the poem quite effectively. So if you follow the first stanza, Lord, who createst man in wealth and store, though foolishly lost the same, decaying more and more till he became most poor. You get tighter and tighter and tighter. It gets to be less and less and less per line. Then it begins to expand. With thee, O let me rise as larks harmoniously and sing this day thy victories. Then shall the fall further the flight in me. It's almost the loss or the contraction of faith followed by the expansion of faith through God. It's the loss of potential through aging, loss of potential through life and decay, and then expanded through the glory of God. And that happens in both of the passages. So in many ways, not only does it create figurative wings in the page, but it also does a very effective job of showing that world is less without God, but then more with faith. So it does kind of an interesting way of playing with that. And the reason I pointed out is because pattern poetry is kind of interesting because it's a visual poetic structure as well as a textual structure. So I thought that was kind of interesting and worth taking a look at here. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at Anne Bradstreet. And I do have to flip back and forth my book, unfortunately. Sorry, so we can find the things. Anne Bradstreet. To my dear and loving husband on page 285. And you'll notice I'm skipping out on quite a few things here. A lot of this stuff is things that you're going to cover in English 449A if you're in the major. And generally speaking, the form doesn't change wildly too much between here and there. I wanted to try and really kind of cover as much as I possibly could instead of just kind of settling for as little as I possibly could. Oh, I forgot to discuss John Milton. John Milton's piece about Shakespeare. We'll get that in the way to On Shakespeare, on page 260 by John Milton. John Milton is a major, major English poet. He lived after Shakespeare did. They overlapped a little bit, but his On Shakespeare is really it was the first poem he published, and it was published in a book of Shakespeare's plays. And Milton is a very, very well-known poet. He's extremely well-known. Paradise Lost is considered one of the great epic poems in the English language. I highly recommend you read it. It's a fascinating read. As much as an epic poem can be a fascinating read, one would say. But I decided not to have us read it because it's very extensively covered in English literature classes. And if you take 449 here, there's a very good chance you'll be reading a significant amount of Milton, or there's a chance you've read a fair amount of Milton before. So what I had us read, though, about Milton is On Shakespeare, because I think it's a really interesting poem, because what it kind of does is it shows how well educated Milton was. Milton was a classically educated man, and he was very, very sharp. But he does a really interesting job, I think, here of saying something rather kind of lovely about Shakespeare, and also saying something about the idea of fame and poetic fame. The line that ends it, I think, dost make us marvel of too much conceiving, and so sepultured in such pomp dost lie, that kings for such a tomb would wish to die. And what he's saying here, I think, is a really kind of interesting statement about Shakespeare, that Shakespeare will be more remembered than royalty in his death because of the works he's left behind. And those works are in some way his tomb. They're the thing that's going to outlast him. They're the thing that's going to continue. They carry him through history the same way a king's tomb carries a king through history. And what he says is that these things are still living. It will keep Shakespeare will outlast. His writing, his tomb, is more beautiful and more fantastic than anything a king has ever produced. And I think that's kind of an interesting way to think about the idea of legacy here. And I think for someone like Milton, who was really kind of interested in the idea of legacy and also really interested in doing great artistic literary works and really putting time in to make something beautiful, I think it was kind of an interesting place to start his career by talking about that idea of legacy for another poet. So now we'll head on to Anne Bradstreet on page 285. To my dear and loving husband. If ever two were one, then surely we, if ever man were loved by wife than thee. So one of the things I think is interesting about Anne Bradstreet is Anne Bradstreet was a Puritan, and she was actually one of the first female poets who was actually spent a significant part of her life in the New World. She was a New World Puritan poet, so she was writing in North America in the English colonies, and she was writing in that time period. She's one of the first female writers, really, that England has on American shores. This is not to say anything about the people who were already here. Trust me, they had their own beautiful artistic methodologies, things along those lines. They had their own culture that was very, very rich. I'm just saying she's the first person with English descent on the American colonies, the first woman who we have a significant amount of poems from. She was the first major kind of figure of female English North American literature. I probably over-explained that more than I need to, but it was worth saying that I'm not saying that until the English got here there was no culture, because that was entirely not the truth. As a matter of fact, you want to talk to me about like actual American literature? American literature through the English is pretty spotty for the first couple hundred years. I don't really like it until it gets a little bit longer down the road. But that's aside the point. So, to my dear and loving husband. And I think one of the things that's interesting is if you read this poem, it's a fairly simple poem. The rhyme structure is simple, the line structure is very simple, the meter is simple, the rhythm is simple. And it kind of very much fits in with, it's just a constant series of heroic couplets. If ever two were one, if ever two were one, if ever two were one, then surely we, if ever man were loved by a wife, then thee. Yeah, it's a fairly simple structure and pattern to it. And the heroic couplet pairing, I think, is fairly simple as well. And I think in many ways that's representative of a kind of a Puritan style. There's not a lot of fancy language here. There's not a lot of fancy poetic tricks. It's very simple, and it also ties the idea of romantic love into Christian love at the end, which I think is very Puritan in its nature. And if you looked at the other Anne Bradstreet's pieces, it's very similar. There's not a whole lot of fancy language in here, and there's not a whole lot of references like you would find in a Milton or you'd find in a Johnson or something along those lines. So I think that's worth pointing out. So after Anne Bradstreet, we jump to something entirely different, and now for something completely different, as they used to say. I think that was on Pee-wee's Playhouse, actually, when I was a kid. So now for something completely different. Let's talk about Jonathan Swift, A Description of a City Shower. So I believe I told you last week when I talked about Chaucer that Chaucer was a great satirist, and he kind of paved a way for a great number of other English satirists down the road. And that is definitely the case for Jonathan Swift. Jonathan Swift is deeply satirical. And if you read from A Description of a City Shower, he's taking poetry and he's applying it to something. Usually poems are about the beauty and the transcendent nature of things and the loveliness of humanity and culture. And Jonathan Swift writes just about how disgusting human beings really are in a city. A sable cloud athwart the welkin flings that swill more liquor than can contain it, like a drunkard gives enough. He's talking about, he's basically comparing the raining clouds to someone barfing up booze. Flirts in your mop and not so clean, you fly, invoke the gods and stop drinking. I mean, he just really points out just how gross everything really is in a city. I mean, from that final line, sweeping from butcher's stalls, dung, guts, and blood, drowned puppies, stinking sprats, all drenched in mud, dead cats and turnip tops come tumbling down the flood. Jonathan Swift was kind of a crab. He was not wildly excited about humanity. He was not wildly excited about human society. He thought people were, for the most part, not wildly great. He was very much a satirist of human culture. He was not necessarily an unhappy person, but he was, for the most part, not what you would call a people person per se either. If you've ever read Gulliver's Travels, it's very much the case. But one of the reasons I wanted us to read this, and I wanted to have you read Jonathan Swift in general, is he's a major literary figure, but I also wanted you to read Jonathan Swift just to point out that his poetry is just as sharp-tongued and witty as his prose was. And he really did write satirical poetry, which is something that kind of has its little time period here, and we'll talk about Pope here in a minute. And Pope was also very much a satirist in a lot of ways. Pope wrote beautiful lines, but he also wrote very satirical lines. Swift was mostly just a satirist for the most part. So, since I mentioned Pope, let's go ahead and pop on over to him as well. Let's see. Alexander Pope was an interesting writer. One of the things that's really kind of remarkable about Alexander Pope is Alexander Pope he paid for his life through poetry. Writing was what paid his bills, and that was not extremely common at the time, especially for poets, but Pope did make it work for him, and Pope was actually kind of a social kind of gadfly about English society, which was actually kind of interesting for someone who had a hunchback from, he had tuberculosis in his bones, and he was rather malformed, but he did manage to get around quite well in English society for the most part. And he wrote some really kind of fantastic classic satirical poems, and the Dunciad is one of those. And one of the reasons I think the Dunciad's interesting, because it kind of gives us a chance to talk about the idea of the Enlightenment. One of the things that was happening in the early 18th century, late 17th century, early 18th century, was the fact that poets, what they were doing in this time period, and early we had to switch to what was called, what came through was the Enlightenment. And what the Enlightenment basically was it had some really interesting things as far as political freedom and things like that, such as the idea of the individual should be free and the individual has rights as an individual, and it kind of had a lot of inspiring revolutionary social rhetoric behind it. But the other thing the Enlightenment brought around with it was the Enlightenment also brought around the age of materialism and empiricism, where we started shifting less and less from a metaphysical, philosophical, cosmic view of what reality was and shifting more and more towards the scientific, empirical view we have now. And there was, to some extent, a lot of concern about the Enlightenment to some degree, and in concern that's expressed here by Pope, the idea of dullness, And what he refers to dullness as is the center of a mock-apocalyptic vision, the lights of arts and sciences is extinguished. And what he really thought was going to extinguish it was materialism, the belief that everything has a material cause, that everything that comes down to its material property. And materialism was actually something that was kind of part of the Enlightenment as well, because one of the things that happened in the Enlightenment is there was also a booming middle class. The middle class had kind of started and begun to grow during the English Renaissance, but it really boomed during the Enlightenment. And merchants and traders and things like that were making far more money in some ways than nobles were. And for someone like Pope, who did support them to some extent and was not necessarily always in love with nobility, but he was also very much an apologist for nobility and social classes to some degree that's been pointed out from him as well. But for him, the idea of materialism as a poet kind of choked on that a little bit, for the same reasons a lot of people kind of choke on materialism and consumerism today. But if you kind of look through it, you see, for example, art after art goes out in all his night. See skulking truth to her old cavern fed, mountains of casuistry heaped overhead. Casuistry is the cause and effect belief that was built into materialism. And he's saying that there's something, that truth is beyond cause and effect. And what he's pointing to is that higher aspects of the world, the spiritual aspects of the world, the artistic aspects of the world, the emotional aspects of the world, that pure materialism kind of dismissed. So the physic of metaphysic begs defense, and metaphysic calls for aid on sense. See mystery to mathematics fly. The idea of like loss of mystical knowledge to mathematical knowledge. In vain they gaze, turn giddy, rave, and die. Religion blushing veils her sacred fires, and unawares morality expires. The belief that if we lose religion, we're going to lose morality, and if we invest ourselves in simply scientific belief and material belief, we lose the spiritual side of ourselves. It's things we've heard before, but in this high moment of the Enlightenment, for someone like Pope, this would really kind of hit very, very hard. And it's a lovely poem in a lot of ways. It's very, very well put together. Pope is very, very careful with his language, with his usage, his repetitions, his patterns. He's a really great he was a fantastic poet. But for us, to some extent, we might look back and say, well, he's kind of almost suggesting superstition matters more. And I don't necessarily think that he's saying superstition matters more. What I think Pope's kind of pointing at here is that when we become purely material, or we start thinking purely of the world in material terms, we start to lose some of the other aspects of life that kind of give it meaning. So that was kind of my thought. Pope's, yeah, so he was a social wit as well, and that kind of nicely takes us to Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, not Larry, Lady. Sorry about that. And I wanted to go ahead and say a few things about Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, because I think she's a really interesting figure. She's very much an early feminist, and she was a social activist. She, for example, was someone who was really interested in influenza and disease outbreaks. She traveled very extensively. She was a noble woman. She was fairly wealthy herself. She believed that marriage was a social trap for women. She very much believed that women should have a right to an intellectual life and an educational life, the same as men. She wasn't quite as behind equality as we would expect for a feminist these days, but she was very much of the belief that women were mistreated in society and held back in society, and they should not be. And she was actually an incredibly sharp wit, as you can kind of see to some extent by reading The Lover Ballad, but she was a wit up there with Pope and Swift. And as a matter of fact, she wrote about Pope and Swift and wrote rather scathing things about them, and they did the same thing to her. But she was very much against the kind of misogyny she found in Pope and Swift, and she was very quick to point it out when she saw it. So she was a very interesting woman, and a very, very good poet, a very sharp, very well-educated woman, and a very, very talented poet. Because The Lover, in its turn, does a very, very good job of being very, very honest, but very, very direct, but also very, very beautiful at the same time. So, for example, this and stupid difference so often you blame is not owing to nature, to fear, or to shame. I am not as cold as a virgin in lead, nor in Sunday's sermon so strong in my head. I know but too well how time flies along, that we live but few years, and yet fewer are young. So she's really kind of addressing that idea that, like, no, I'm not celibate simply because of my religion, and that's not because I'm not aware that I'm going to die someday. And she kind of goes along to the she keeps up with this idea, and but she says very much what she wants out of a man, which is something that not was always the case. Usually, it was the belief was, well, women just want to be loved by any man, and she says, no, not at all. There's a very particular kind of man I want, and she has a really kind of great line at the end of the second to last stanza. But till this astonishing creature I know, as long as I have lived chaste, I will keep myself so. And she basically says, I don't want anyone who's not what I'm looking for. I'm not going to waste my time with someone who's just going to make me miserable or unhappy, and until I find the lover I want, I'm not taking the lover. I will never share the wanton coquette, or be caught by a vain affection of wit. Their toasters and songsters may try all their art, but never shall enter the pass of my heart. I loathe the lewd rake, the dressed fopling despise. Before such pursuers the nice virgin flies, and as Ovid has sweetly in parables told, we harden like trees and like rivers are cold. Just a very kind of lovely, well put together piece. She's a great poet, and I really this is one of the poems that we read that's kind of one of my favorites. I really like the idea of the lover ballad. I think it's very nicely put together, and it's very honest, and it seems to have a very strong sense of it gives a strong sense of Montague as an individual, and also gives a strong sense of Montague in relation to being just as outspoken as the men of her period, which I think is really important in English history, because this was not particularly the case. And one of the things that kind of happened in the Enlightenment is we see the beginnings of the feminist movement, and she's a kind of very early figure in that. So let's talk about William Henry Cowper. William Cowper, lines written during a period of insanity. And here we kind of make a shift from the Enlightenment more towards the Romantic poets. And we'll talk about Romanticism fairly heavily here in the near future. But here we're kind of shifting into the Romantic period, Romantic poets. And the Romantic poets, to some extent, were known really for their love of nature, known for their love of really heavy, thick emotions, just kind of the bare your chest and plunge the knife into it type kind of emotional material. And Cowper kind of brings this in. He was very much interested in nature and the natural world, but he was also very religious and kind of evangelical, and he thought he was going to hell, so he has these really heavy kind of emotional pieces. And he also had mental illness. So the lines written during a period of insanity was actually written when he had a breakdown. And I think the rhythm of this is really kind of effective. So hatred and vengeance, my eternal portion, scarce can endure delay of execution, wait with impatient readiness to seize my soul in a moment. The kind of the breakdown of the rhyme, this pattern of the heroic couplets, just the rhyme breakdown. So it almost seems like he gets into a rhyme, and then the rhyme collapses, and the lines kind of... but there's also kind of consistent rhythm here, but the rhyme itself is kind of varying throughout the most part. There's a fairly consistent rhythm to it. There's, of course, variations in all cases. But the drop in the kind of the pattern that's not quite a pattern, I think in many ways kind of fits in with the idea of insanity. I think in some ways it kind of fits very, very nicely with what Oliver was talking about when she talked about how the balancing out rhythm, how balancing out repetition with alteration kind of can create poetic effects. And I think Cowper does a very good job of that here. And after Cowper, of course, we talk about William Blake, and William Blake is probably right up there with Shakespeare as one of... William Blake might be considered one of the most important English poets. He's up there with Keats, he's up there with Shelley, and that's very much has to do with the fact that Blake kind of kicks off, he's the first really big figure of the Romantic period. They call him proto-romantics, but I would say that he really kind of slips into Romanticism just more so than Cowper does, and more so than Robbie Burns does, who we'll talk about here in a minute. But Blake was a very interesting guy. He was a poet, a painter, and a printmaker. He was also really interested in philosophy and mysticism and revolutionary kind of ideas. He was interested in revolutionary politics. He believed that marriage, to some extent, was a manipulation. He was a supporter of early feminist movements, a bunch of really kind of heavy social. He was not a fan of slavery, things along those lines. He was supportive of revolutionary social movement in general. And he was really against organized religion and sexual repression, though he very much believed in God and he very much believed in religion. He thought that organized religion was a repression tool, so he was very much against rejecting kind of dogmatic and doctrine-based religions. And he was kind of skeptical, very much so, of industrialism, and he was also skeptical to some extent, because one of the things that does happen with the Enlightenment and follows hot on the heels of the Enlightenment is the Industrial Revolution, and the Romantics in many ways reject a lot of the beliefs of the Industrial Revolution, which we'll talk more about when we talk about Romanticisms. But one of the things that happens in the Industrial Revolution is people become to be viewed as kind of capital or as workers, and you think about people as a resource for a factory. Blake was very much against that kind of thinking. He was very much against the idea of these factories spitting smoke into the sky, and he was not a fan of these things because he thought that ultimately they were destructive to the human spirit and to human freedom and things along those lines. And he often wrote about social ills and things like that in his work. So, for example, The Sick Rose, if we take a look at the first poem I assigned you, 446, O rose, thou art sick, the invisible worm that flies in the night and the howling storm has found out thy bed of crimson joy, and his dark secret love does thy life destroy. So you could read this as talking about a sexual affair, and one of the things that Blake was very much against was he was against the idea of affairs and against heartbreaks and things along those lines, and he was against the cheapening of lovemaking and turning it just into sex. He talked fairly often about his issues with prostitution and things along those lines. But one of the things he was also talking about in his poems like The Sick Rose is he was talking about syphilis. One of the things that was a major problem in this time period was syphilis, simply because of the fact that people had no idea. They knew it was spread sexually, but they had no idea of how to treat it or how to handle it, and there was no treatment for it. But also there was issues with syphilis in the fact that there were many, many prostitutes in London, and a very high number of them had it, and they were very, very busy, one might say. So there was a major syphilis problem during Blake's time period, and very much so through the 17th and 18th century in general. And one of the things that happens in his poems like The Sick Rose is he's actually talking about syphilis. I don't know if it's included here, but he has a poem called London. And one of the things that he says, he's talking about the problems of London, and one he says, but one is the smoke bellowing out of the buildings, and the other one, of course, is the horrible syphilis from the prostitutes. And I think that he's very kind of direct about what he saw as social ills in his time. I think The Tiger, which is a very classic poem, does a really great job of capturing the mystical, metaphysical, kind of philosophical side of Blake. And I think ultimately, too, it's kind of just a beautiful poem in the way it uses rhythm and the way it uses rhyme and just kind of the meter of it. Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night, what a mortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? And you could force it to be symmetry, which I'm wondering if he did in the time period. In what distance deeper skies burnt the fire of thine eyes? On what wings dare he aspire? What the hand dare seize the fire? And what shoulder and what art could twist the sinews of thy heart? And when thy heart began to beat, what dread hand and what dread feet? What the hammer, what the chain, in what furnace was thy brain? What the anvil, what dread gasp dare its deadly terrors clasp? When the stars threw down their spears and watered heaven with their tears, did he smile his work to see? Did he who make the lamb make thee? Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night, what a mortal hand or eye dare frame thy fearful symmetry? And this is a really kind of, I think it's a very strong metaphysical poem, and I think that it kind of gets revealed because basically when he's talking about the tiger and contemplating the tiger as a creature of death, what he's really doing is he's asking who would make this thing. And so he's questioning God to some extent. And that really comes to a head when he says, when the stars threw down their spears and watered heaven with their tears, did he smile his work to see? Did he who make the lamb make thee? And what he's doing is he's contemplating the dual nature of God here. He's contemplating the God as the savior, but he's also contemplating God as the destroyer, because the tiger is the representation of destruction, violence, things along, and all things that kind of come with that. But then he's also asking, could a God who made the Savior, or who gave us his Son for our redemption, could he also make something that would destroy so readily, or something so violent, or something that's so perfectly a hunter? And I think that he's contemplating the dual nature of love in that, the dual nature of God in that poem, and that's one of the things I like. I also like it because it appeared in Batman the Animated Series, so when I was a kid, and I remember it from that. So that was something that kind of came to mind too. But Blake is very much a classic, and I do recommend if you're interested and you like what you saw of Blake, track down some Blake collections, because they're definitely worth reading. He's a very, very solid poet. And speaking of solid poets, I also really like our last poet of this one today, which is Robert Burns. Robert Burns was a Scottish poet. He was a Romantic Scottish poet, but he's really, really famous, and some call him, he's probably the most famous and most beloved poet in Scotland. And it's because he wrote very much in a Scots dialect. So if you read A Red, Red Rose, you'll take a look at it and see, oh, my luve's like a red, red rose that's newly sprung in June. Oh, luve's like the melody that's sweetly played in tune. As fair art thou, my bonny lass, so deep in luve am I. I will love thee still, my dear, till the seas gang dry. I mean, it's a dialectic, and it's not a dialect I can speak well, because I'm not very good at dialects. But he wrote his poems in a Scots dialect. He wanted to capture the way English sounded in Scotland in particular. And he wrote about very frequently about the beauty of Scotland and the Scottish Isles. And he's very much beloved in Scotland because of that, and because he made such an effort to capture what was particular about being Scottish in the United Kingdom. People tend to think the United Kingdom is entirely united, and everyone tends to speak, or at least used to think, that everyone had the same thoughts and beliefs and spoke the same way. And Burns said no, there's something peculiar, special about being Scottish. In the same way there's something different about being Irish, or there's something different about being Welsh and living in the United Kingdom. So A Red, Red Rose really kind of captures that, and it's just it's a very, very simple poem, but it's very, very lovely, and there's something very, very evocative about all of Robbie Burns' poems. Oh, my love's like red, that's newly sprung in June. Oh, my love's like the melody that's sweetly played to. And he just layers things in there very, very effectively, and it just has kind of a feel of a place to it. And I think a lot of that comes from the dialect. So, and I just want to point out that that's something interesting, because it's not always often that you see people write in dialect. And it's always interesting when you do, especially when you see someone like Burns do it. So, those are what I wanted you to read for this week. As far as what I need you to do for this week, we should wrap up the critiques of the first two projects. I will assign you critique for the next project, so you should be working on that. I'll just assign that probably right after I post this. And then from there on in, what you need to do for this week is you just need to go ahead and make sure you're reading for next week. Oh, and the poetry project for this week is the Ekphrasis poem. And the Ekphrasis poem is really a poem about art. So really, I don't necessarily care what form you use again. You can kind of go to do whatever you want to, but you should be writing about something artistic. So just make sure you follow the instructions for that. And you should be writing about another work of art, because that's what Ekphrasis poem is. Ekphrasis poems are poems that comment on other art. So it can be anything you want it to be, though. So generally, I think originally it was poems commenting on visual art, and a classic example of that would be Ode to a Grecian Urn. And we'll talk about that when we talk about Keats. But you've got your reading assignment. You've got things to review. You've got things to critique. I've also put the poetry bundle assignment. That's something you'll be working on. I don't know necessarily when I have it set for due. I might move that a little bit depending on what happens, or when it's actually set for. But just make sure you're working that. And also, I've put the poetry analysis paper assignment up. I'm not going to talk about it this week, but you should read it and you should be aware of it, so I'll talk about it next week. All right? Okay, so that's it for this week. Take care, be well, and I will talk to you folks again in 7 days.